I've grown my property portfolio to $35 million before the age of 28. And in this video, I'm going to run you through this step-by-step process that I personally use to grow my portfolio and at what stage you are going to be able to create passive income for you to get out of the rat race. Let's jump into it. The strategy that we use and that I've personally used to create the portfolio is broken down into 5 very distinct parts. The issue I see with property investors generally is they want to do everything at once. And what I've learned from business and what people would know in lots of different areas of life, whether it's health and fitness, whether it's relationship, if you try and do everything at once, often nothing ever works because you're giving a little bit of attention to lots of different things. So we like to hyper focus in on one strict point at the certain time in the journey. And I'll break down exactly what part of the journey you are at so you can understand what you should be doing next in your portfolio. So the first step in our portfolio structure is the accumulation phase. Obviously, if you are starting with little to no money, you actually can't grow any wealth without accumulating more money. So in the accumulation phase, we can't get this mistaken with trying to create passive income or thinking that the first asset that we invest in is going to get us out of the rat race. Because the reality is, even if you bought one property at the median price in Australia, which would be circa $1 million, maybe slightly under, and it had no debt on it, that property is maybe going to give you $40,000 or $50,000 a year in gross rental income, which won't get you out of the rat race. So you need to grow your wealth to a position where you have a high enough net equity number to actually give you the income that you want. So in the accumulation phase of your real estate journey, most people will start with a small amount of money. In my own situation, I started with a 10% deposit on a $720,000 asset. Was my first property. It was an apartment in the suburb of Coogee in Sydney. And essentially I put that $72,000 into a property. So it was a 10% deposit on a $720,000 property. And all of a sudden now I had this $720,000 asset that had $72,000 of my money sitting in it. And it had, give or take, $650,000 worth of the bank's money sitting in it. Now, what happens is with real estate, and I bought my first asset in 2015, is the properties increase in value over time. Now, from 2015 to 2018, Australia saw a huge amount of growth, probably similar to what we saw between 2019 and say 2022. So I put my $72,000 into the property. I got a $720,000 asset, and within 12 months, that property had grown from $720,000 to about $900,000. Now, what's happened now is I've turned my $72,000 of equity that I put into the deal into a few $100,000 of equity now, because essentially what happens is as the property value grows, your debt level does not. So with the first property, I had $650,000 of the bank's money, $72,000 of my money. The property then grew from $720,000 to $900,000, which added $180,000 worth of value to the property. But the $650,000 of bank's money never changed. So now I had $650,000 of the bank's money, plus $70,000 of my money, plus $180,000 of increased money. So now I had $250,000 of my own money in it and $650,000 of the bank's money. And then instead of selling that property and getting my $250,000 minus my selling costs and capital gains tax and all the rest of it, I used that money to then go and buy another asset, which is how we accumulate properties. And that cycle is essentially a rinse and repeat. So from when I turned 18 years old to when I turned 22 years old, I bought a property every single year from doing that exact strategy. I bought one, I let that grow in value, I used the equity, which is the gap between what you have in a mortgage and what the property is worth, then as the deposit for the next property. Borrowed more money off the bank, bought property number 2. Then I had 2 properties in the market. 12 months later, those properties grow in value. You have more equity. You borrow the equity out of those properties, buy property number 3. And it was a rinse and repeat strategy. But unfortunately, we cannot do this forever. And that's what brings me to the next step in the strategy, which is, no, that is not a Ferrari. We don't go and buy a Ferrari just yet. That happens later in the strategy. This part of the strategy is called the acceleration part of the strategy. So in my own journey, it was accumulation first. I bought the first 4 properties, and then what happened is there is a thing called serviceability or borrowing capacity with the banks. And that essentially means that every dollar you earn, the banks will lend you a certain amount of dollars against that income. But eventually your income stops going up as rapidly, you're carrying debt, and the bank say, Mr. Jack or Mr. whoever, Mrs. whoever, we will not lend you any more money, which essentially then means you get to a ceiling. So what happened was I accumulated 4 assets. The bank said no more money, but I didn't want to stop growing. I didn't want to just say, okay, well, that's it now. I'm 22 years old. I can't do anything else. So what I then did was I looked at my existing portfolio of 4 properties and said, how can I continue to accelerate my wealth? How can I grow my wealth still without needing to go borrow another $7 or $8 or $900,000 from the bank? And the answer to that, and this acceleration part of the journey, is essentially looking at the 4 properties that we've bought, the 3 properties, the 10 properties that we've bought here, to say, what else can we do to those properties to make them worth more money and, in essence, accelerate our wealth? So when I bought my first 4 properties, I had just under $4 million worth of gross assets, and I was probably carrying about $2.8 to $3 million worth of debt. I then moved into the acceleration stage and I said, okay, so I've got an apartment in Coogee, I had an apartment in Maroubra, I had an apartment in Bar Beach, and I had an apartment in Adamstown in Newcastle. So I said, well, the 4 properties that I own right now, what can I do to those properties to make them worth more money? And which one of these properties is going to be the easiest to add more money? So I said, okay, the first property that I can add more money to and enhance the value, accelerate the value, was the apartment in Bar Beach. So I started to renovate that. I painted, I put a new kitchen, I put new flooring in, I did new electrical, I did new wardrobes. And essentially the apartment that I paid $660,000 for, I spent $40,000 on, so I was in for $700,000, and I got that property revalued at just under $900,000. Now that property that I bought back in 2019-ish, I think it was, is now worth $1.2 million. But I took it from being worth $660,000 with a $40,000 renovation to then being worth just under $900,000. So instead of going to borrow $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 from the bank, I only used $40,000 of money and I added $300,000 worth of value to the property, which all of a sudden makes my property portfolio worth more money and in essence accelerates my wealth. So I'm not just standing still doing nothing. So, and then I did that with the other properties, the Coogee apartment, I renovated it, the Maroubra apartment, I renovated it. I actually renovated the whole block of apartments. The Adamstown property I couldn't really add too much value to. So the accumulation and the acceleration phase can go on for many, 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 many years. It depends on when you are starting your journey. It depends on how big of a portfolio you want to grow. It depends on how much wealth you want to create. But this period here for me is still continuing to happen today, because I accumulated 4 properties. I then accelerated the journey of those 4 properties. And what I realized is if I stayed in my current job and I stayed in my current earning capacity, I wouldn't be able to borrow more money. So while I was adding value to the first 4 properties that I purchased, I then started to think about, well, if I still want to grow my portfolio from being 4 properties to 10 to 15 to 20 properties, what is the one thing that I'm currently missing? It wasn't equity, because I had equity in these 4 properties. I had enough money for deposits to go buy more, but it was serviceability. It was the income. So I was 23 years old and I said, okay, I'm going to change career paths. I'm going to get out of mining and construction and I'm going to go and earn more money, which then leads us onto step number 3 in the portfolio journey, is the incubation stage. Now, this is Hender-ingo the flamingo, and he is just kicking back on the beach. He's enjoying life. He's not retired yet. This is not Hender-ingo retired. This is Hender-ingo and Jack Henderson waiting for the marketplace to do the heavy lifting. Now, as I said, I was 23 when I got out of construction and mining. 23 was 5 years ago. So it's 2024 as I'm filming this video. 2019 is when I got out of the construction and the mining industry. If you remember back to 2019, what happened between 2019 and 2022 was one of the biggest booms we've ever seen in Australia. And that's the period of time where I made the most amount of money in property that I've ever made. But the interesting thing was I didn't do anything. All I did was wait. All I did was kick back on a beach, enjoy life, and the marketplace did the heavy lifting, which is the incubation stage. And if you look at your own portfolio, if you have one, or if you don't have a portfolio, if you look at your parents or your grandparents or someone you know who owns property, there is this incubation stage. And if you think about incubation like a chicken inside of an egg, the eggs, obviously the chicken's growing and eventually will hatch out. It's the time that you wait between when you buy and when you potentially sell, or when you get a property revalued. And it's the property growing in value by simply the marketplace growing and just lifting the value of all of the properties. So during this waiting period where I didn't have the serviceability to buy more properties and I'd already gone back and added value to the properties that I owned, I was essentially using this incubation, this waiting period, to grow my income. So the marketplace was growing the wealth through properties, so I wasn't losing money, I was still making a lot of money through capital growth. And while that was happening, I then focused on going, okay, how do I make more money? How do I make myself more valuable so I can go back and borrow more money from the bank? So from 2019 to 2021 is when I transitioned out of mining and construction into property as a full-time career and a full-time business. And when you're starting your own business, generally banks won't lend you any money for a few years. So I knew that there was a good chance that I wasn't going to be able to borrow any money for a minimum of 12 months, and there was a good chance maybe 24 months. But I didn't care about that because I had the existing portfolio growing in the marketplace, and I used this incubation period to grow my income. Fast forward to 2021. I'd had 2 years in business. I had enough financials to grow my wealth again. I had really, really strong income. I've about tripled my income that I was on when I was in construction and mining over that 24-month period. And the amazing thing was the $3.5 to $4 million worth of assets I had from the accumulation and the acceleration phase of my journey had gone from being worth $3.5, $4 million to being worth $6 million. So all of a sudden now I had a few $1 million worth of equity, and I'd used this incubation stage to grow my income 3 times what it was when I was at this acceleration stage. And all of a sudden what happened was I now had more serviceability and I had a heap of equity in the properties that I could go and scale really quickly. In between 2021 and 2023, my portfolio value 5x'd. It went up by 500% because I had the equity in the portfolio already, and all I needed to do was solve the income equation. So my portfolio went from being worth $3.5, $4 million to being worth $20 million within 12 to 24 months. And the funny thing was, I essentially went back to this accumulation stage and back to this acceleration stage. So this period, because I started when I was 18 years old, will likely happen until I turn 40, 45, maybe even 50 years old, because my core income comes from my business and I love what I do. I don't plan on retiring or stepping back anytime soon. So anytime that I accumulate more assets, I generate more equity, and I wait in the marketplace to do the heavy lifting, instead of moving to step number 4, which I'm about to run you through next, I just keep reinvesting the profits back into accumulating more assets, accelerating those assets, waiting in the marketplace, and going again. So my portfolio now is about $35 million. It's a combination of residential and commercial properties, but it's going to be a very, very long time before I move to step 4 because I'm still only 28 years old. Now, let's fast forward to Jack being 55 years old. I've got a beard, I'm over it, I don't want to work anymore, I don't want to shoot these YouTube videos. What happens then is, because every time you buy more properties, accelerate your journey, wait in the marketplace, buy more properties, you're essentially taking on more debt. You're borrowing more money from the bank to go and buy more properties, to grow your wealth more, you borrow more money from the bank, you buy more properties, and you keep going and going. But eventually, I don't want debt, I want cash flow. I don't want growth, I want cash flow. And this right here is what takes us to step number 4 in the Flamingo investment strategy, which is the consolidation phase. As you can see there, there's a fork in the road. And essentially what happens is we've grown a huge portfolio up here. Let's use my property portfolio as an example, $35 million worth of assets. And let's say I've got $10 million worth of net equity in that, which means the debt's 25, value's 35, there's $10 million if I was to sell it, and that's what I'd have left in cash. I get to a fork in the road. This here takes me back up here. Buy more assets, grow your wealth, wait in the market. This here says, I'm getting off the growing, I'm getting off the accumulation, I'm getting off the acceleration, I'm now going the consolidation. I'm done, I want cash flow, and I don't really care about any more growth. So this consolidation phase essentially says, what wealth have we actually created? Remember, when I started up here, property number 1, $72,000 I had. Now I have 10 million of net equity and I'm 28. Imagine what it looks like when I'm 55, 60 years old. I believe I'll be a billionaire. Time will tell. But we get to this fork in the road and we go, okay, if we were to sell the portfolio down today, pay out the 25 million in debt, pay some capital gains tax, pay some real estate agents, let's say I'm left with $7, maybe $8 million of net equity. With that $8 million, I could just leave it in cash sitting in the bank, put it in a term deposit, maybe get 3 or 4% on my money. 3 or 4% on $6 or $8 million is, 200, 250 grand of income. Or I could invest in more real estate. But you think, Jack, you just said, I don't want to buy more real estate. You want to retire now. You want to go on this road. You don't want to go down this road. You're going to Las Vegas. You want to enjoy life. You don't want to be a slumlord anymore. But there is a type of real estate that you can invest in, which is not so growth focused. It is cash flow focused. And because you are using cash to go into the assets, you got the $6 or $8 million worth of cash, you put that as the deposit and the cost in the assets, and you take on a lower level of debt. So we call it a loan to value ratio, which is as a percentage of a property's value, what percentage is the loan and what percentage of equity or cash have you put into the deal, then the properties start cash flowing themselves. In this part of the strategy here, every time we generate more equity and we buy more properties, we're essentially refinancing, pulling out the equity from the properties. That forms debt, and then we use that debt to go buy more properties. So the properties aren't cash flowing themselves. It's costing money to own these properties every year. When we get to this stage of the journey and we consolidate down, we essentially eliminate all of our debt. We have a big chunk of cash. We invest that cash into the last stage of the journey, which is walking on buckets of money, and this is called the evolution stage. So we've got $6 or $8 million worth of net equity, whatever the number is for you. $6 or $8 million is what I would have right now if I was to sell down. And we move into this evolution stage, which is using that $6 to $8 million, investing it into assets that will generate us cash flow and that will actually get us out of the rat race. So generally speaking, we use commercial property. Commercial property is usually not for growth, it's for cash flow. There's a lot of reasons for that. I'll do a full video on why commercial is not for growth and for cash flow. But in this video, I'm just going to talk the high level around why we use commercial. So let's hypothetically say we use that 6 to 8 million. I'll use 7 million for a round number. And we only wanted to take on a maximum of 60% debt on the commercial assets, which means we would have to put in 40% cash, which would be that $7 million. So that's 7 million of net equity we have. We would then use it as a 40% deposit to go and buy $17.5 million worth of commercial real estate. So on that 17.5 million, we've put down 7, we'd take on 10.5 million worth of debt from the bank, and the assets themselves would be generating a net cash flow of around 7%. On that $17.5 million of assets generating 7% net, we'd be generating $1.225 million of income on that $17.5 million. But we still have $10.5 million worth of debt that we have to pay, also at about 7% interest, which means we'd be paying about $750,000 of interest back to the bank out of the $1.225 million of rental income coming from the commercial properties. Now, the difference between the 750 or 775 and the 1.225 is around about $450,000 to $500,000. That's the gap between our expenses and our income, which means that $500,000 is then the money that you live on, because that's the surplus cash flow. So I'm using my own portfolio as an example here. On this $35 million of assets that I have right now, with $7, $8 million of net equity sitting in that portfolio, it's costing me a significant amount of money to hold that property because I've got $25 million of debt attached to it, and the rental yields on the residential properties are 3 or 4% as a gross rental yield. So it's costing me money. But if I transition that same portfolio and sell it down, pay out some debt, release my money, and then push it into commercial assets, into our evolution stage of the journey, I turn a property portfolio that's probably costing me $500,000 a year to hold into a property portfolio that's giving me $500,000 a year in income. And it's exactly the same net equity position. We've just flipped the portfolio around from being in a growth-focused journey into a cash flow producing journey. And you think about some of the biggest companies in the world, that's how they start. They raise money from investors. They are negative when they start it. They're losing money. You think of the biggest companies in the world now, like your Airbnbs, your Ubers, your Facebooks, all of these huge companies, when they start, they lose money because they're growing, they're reinvesting everything back into the company, they're losing money. And then eventually what happens? The companies go from being loss leaders to profit-making enterprises, and they get to mega scale, and now they're some of the most profitable companies in the world. You look at Apple as an example, they're producing trillions of dollars worth of revenue and making hundreds of billions of dollars in net profit. But when they started, they were losing money. And we build property portfolios exactly the same. We start off by growing our wealth, growing the company, losing money. Then we move into cash flow. And I said, if you kept the $10.5 million worth of debt here, and the $7 million worth of equity, you'd be generating 500 grand a year in income. But let's assume that you still wanted to go and earn money for a few years. That you did this when I was 55-ish, you got 5 years till you actually want to retire. With the 500 of net income that's coming off this portfolio, you can then use that for the next 5 years to decrease more and more debt. So you've got 10.5 million, 500,000 of surplus cash a year. Over the next 5 years, let's assume you put 100% of that back into decreasing the debt. You'd push down $2.5 million of debt off this 10.5, so you'd be left with $8 million worth of debt, which would then free up more cash flow. So you'd actually be producing maybe $700,000 or $800,000 a year in income. And the longer that you reduce your debt for, the more and more income that your portfolio will produce. And that, my friends, is how you build a scalable portfolio that is going to give you enough income to get you out of the rat race in the shortest period of time. I've created this here in less than 10 years. I started just before my 19th birthday. I've just turned 28 in July, and I've built this within 10 years. And if I sold it down today, that's essentially the outcome that I would have. Imagine what it looks like in 10 years time, 15 years time, 20 years time. So the earlier you start this journey, the better this is going to be. The later you start this journey in your life, you can still have an incredible outcome, but the more aggressive you've got to go in this stage here. You can't wait 5 years between each purchase. You've got to buy and go, buy and go, buy and go, because you can't grow your wealth until you have wealth to grow. I hope that helps. Please like and subscribe to the channel. There's going to be so much more of this content. And if there's any of these steps of the strategy that you want me to break down in more detail, please comment below and I'll do a full video on each step if that is valuable. See you on the next one.